these are the imperatives of morality proper, the very things that pure reason dictates that we ought to do solely for the respect of the moral law of a self-consistent free will that determines itself. If you're a water polo player who fails to practice your swimming, that's not a moral transgression. The categorical imperatives, on the other hand, are going to have no conditions attached to them. That's what it means to say that they're categorical, and they apply to everyone. They're laws of morality because they are universal. No one can escape these imperatives. So, what makes non-conditioned imperatives true? We saw that what makes the imperatives of skill true are the means end structure of skills. The means to obtain the skill of playing guitar is to practice your chords. But these are not things that we can think about in the means end style of instrumental reasoning. These come from pure reason alone. In order to grasp Kant's supreme law of morality, from which all moral rules can be derived, we first need to get a bit of vocabulary under our belts. The notion of a maxim. A maxim is a general rule for acting. So it's a general rule that we can apply in different specific situations that outlines what I'll do when that situation arises. So maxims have the form of when insert situation, I insert action in response to that situation. Here are some examples. When I get my paycheck, I donate half to charity, or when I get my paycheck, I put half in savings, or when I get my paycheck, I blow it all on donuts. Whatever it is that you set yourself as a kind of general template for your action, or when I get home from work, I exercise, or when I get home from work, I cook dinner, when I get home from work, I put my shoes away. All of those kinds of things represent potential maxims, rules that we can apply to acting in specific situations. Kant gives three formulations of the categorical imperative that he takes to be all equivalent to one another, three different ways of saying the same idea. I'm only going to go through the first formulation of the categorical imperative. We'll leave the rest for later on. So the first formulation of the categorical imperative is like so. Act only in accordance with that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law of nature. So notice it's something about the content of our maxims that Kant is worried about here, the general rules that we use to address different situations as they arise. Our rules have to have a certain feature to them. That is to say, our rules have to be universalizable. We have to imagine that our maxim was installed at the universal level as a law of nature that everything in fact follows. Two questions. Would it be possible for such a world to exist if my maxim was a law of nature that all beings carried out the universal determinism? Is such a world possible or consistent with the laws of logic? And could I will it? Could I rationally choose to be a member of the resulting world? The categorical imperative provides a frame of reference from which we can exclude the moral worlds from the immoral worlds, and it also provides a test for our maxims to determine whether our maxims have a good will behind them. Namely, they have to be universalizable. If our maxims would not result in a consistent world that we could rationally choose to be a part of, then that means our maxim is immoral. To put it simply, to determine whether your maxim is moral or not, ask yourself, what if everyone did what I'm doing? Could such a world be sustained? Is it logically possible to live in such a world? And is it rational to create such a world? Would it be rational for me to choose to be a member of a world where that maxim was in place with universal necessity? Kant gives several examples of maxims that he claims to rule out, and from there to derive four categorically necessary laws of action, laws of morality. The first case is the false promise case. He says, suppose you have the maxim that when it gets me out of a bind, I'll make a false promise. For example, if I need money from a loan and I know I'm not going to be able to pay the loan back, I'll just make a false promise to repay the loan, get the money, and then deal with the problems later on. The question is my maxim in this case one that I could will to be a universal law of nature? What would that mean? Well, it would mean anytime anyone, here's the universalizability, anytime anyone needed a loan that they could not repay, they would make a false promise to repay the loan. Well, Kant argues that that can't possibly be a maxim in line with the categorical imperative, because such a world where that happened with universal necessity is inconceivable. If everyone deterministically made false promises that they later transgressed, then the very institution of promising could not exist. No one would believe anyone when they tried to make a promise. It would therefore be impossible to make a promise at all. It would therefore be impossible to make a false promise. So the very maxim undermines itself. The maxim of I'll make a false promise when I need to, when we universalize that, everyone makes false promises whenever they need to. Now they can't even make a promise because the whole institution of promising has fallen by the wayside. This is a maxim that cannot be consistently willed as a universal law of nature. It fails this universalizability test. What if everyone was making false promises? No promises could be made at all. Therefore, the maxim destroys itself. So the first thing to call to mind is, remember, typically when we're thinking about what to do, we're using instrumental reasoning. That is, we're thinking about the end and the best way to get there. What Kant is trying to point out to us here is that our use of morality to think about what to do can often contravene our use of instrumental reasoning to think about what to do. It may indeed be that making the false promise is actually the best means in order to obtain my future happiness. I might have a really good plan, right? That I'm going to take the loan money, make a false promise to pay it back, but then I'm going to set up a business and I'm going to earn all the money back, and ultimately, in the long run, I'll be better off, I'll be more happy because I made the false promise. So it may be that making a false promise is the best way to secure your future happiness. That's instrumental reasoning. But moral reasoning, Kant is suggesting, can contravene the results of instrumental reasoning. So in everyday life, we're typically using instrumental reasoning, and moral self-reflection requires stopping and saying, wait, I'm working according to instrumental reasoning, but what would morality counsel me to do? Now let's go through another example of a derivation from the categorical imperative, going a little more explicitly in the step-by-step process. The first thing I need to do is look at the task, look at what I'm about to do, and ask myself, under what maxim am I acting? What's this sort of rule that I'm carrying out here? Formulate your maxim specifically. So for this second example, let's suppose that you have a bank account filled to the brim by your parents. It will never run out. If you run out, they'll fill it with more. You're filthy rich. Everything's provided for. And you think, why bother doing anything? I might as well just use all this money to satisfy all of my desires, to live a pleasurable life. Set aside all the hard work. So the maxim that you're formulating in this case is something like this: when I have all my needs met, I'll just enjoy life and not bother with developing my talents. It's hard to develop talents. We're all born with these or those natural talents, but that's not enough. We've got to work hard to practice developing them. So we can conceive of someone with this maxim that, if I didn't need to develop my talents to earn money, then I'll just throw those talents away and enjoy life. Now I need to take the second step and universalize my maxim. I need to contemplate what would happen if my maxim became a universal law of nature, just as physically binding as the law of gravity. When anyone has all needs met, everyone will just enjoy life and not bother with developing their talents. Next, step 3, imagine the world that results from universalizing your maxim. I need to think about what would the resulting world be like if it was in all other respects just like our own, except also this new law of nature was established that when anyone has all their needs met, everyone neglects their natural talents. What would that world be like? Next, on the basis of my work in step 3, imagining what the world would be like, I need to run a contradiction test. So this is where the deliberation kicks in. I'm not deliberating about means to ends, I'm deliberating about the logical worth of such a maxim. There are two ways for a maxim to fail the contradiction test. First, the maxim might result in a logically impossible world. So I need to ask myself, is such a world logically possible? Remember back to the previous example about making false promises. That failed this first logical possibility test. Because remember, a world in which everyone made false promises is a world in which there are no such thing as promises. But that's a logical contradiction. Everyone making false promises and the very institution of promising cannot coexist logically. Now, with our current example, is the world logically possible in which everyone neglected their talents when they already had the means to live their life? Such a world seems possible. There's nothing logically inconsistent in thinking about a world in which everyone or almost everyone neglects their talents. It would simply be a world in which fewer people did fewer extraordinary things, but there's nothing logically incoherent about that. So the maxim doesn't logically destroy itself. But now we need to ask ourselves, okay, if it is logically possible to have such a world, could I rationally choose to exist in that world without knowing what my place in it would be? Without knowing whether I was going to be a king or a pauper, would it make sense for me to choose to be a member of that world? Kant argues no, it would be irrational for us to choose to be a member of such a world. It's only rational to choose to be a member of a world in which everyone attempts to develop their talents to the best of their ability. So this maxim, though it passes step A, fails at step B. So from the categorical imperative, we have now derived to Kant's satisfaction two duties: the duty that I ought not make false promises and the duty that I ought to develop my talents. There are other examples that Kant gives in the reading. I'll leave it as an exercise to the reader to work those out and perhaps test other maxims that you come up with against the categorical imperative. Remember, to come to these, all it required was that we use our own mind, our own reason to think these through against the possibility of a lawful will. No one gave us these laws but ourselves, so it's important to frame these in the first person. I'm giving myself the will. A free will is one that determines itself in accordance with the laws of morality that it gives itself by virtue of its pure practical reason and not by virtue of anything outside of it, whether that be instrumental reasoning, whether that be God, whether that be your parents or your teachers. You give yourself the laws of morality. Therefore, in following those laws, you are a free being.